Hello, my name is Georgie, and today I'll be answering some questions on the book Liliana's Invincible Summer, A Sister's Search for Justice. This requires me to answer 5 trigger questions without a script. There's no script in the questions and justification and whatnot. But I will be dividing this into 5 parts. So if there's a few cuts, then that's why. Okay, first of all, the first question. While reading Liliana's Invincible Summer, were there moments where you recognized forms of violence that are often ignored or normalized in everyday life? Why do you think society overlooks them? Okay, to answer the first part of the question, were there moments of where I recognize forms of violence which are often ignored or normalized in everyday life? Yes, particularly in the sections where the author was recounting how Liliana's boyfriend often kept tabs on him. For example, paying, I think it was a junkie down the street, 3,000 pesos or something along those lines, just to keep track of her comings and goings. I think that's kind of, maybe it was for the time period, it's a bit more accepted. I think nowadays, it would be a bit okay, it's a bit peculiar, you keeping track of your partner's comings and goings, but it's not really it's not too serious, so it can definitely be ignored and just be oh, okay, it's whatever. It's just played off as, oh, that partner or that person is a bit possessive over their partner or something along those lines. Are there any other instances that I can think of? I think just in general, the possessiveness and verbal abuse, it can definitely be overlooked as people just arguing. It happens, people do get emotional, people do argue a lot, especially in relationships, and they can just be ignored as because I think a lot of people in society, they go through the same, it's similar issues, everybody gets heated and annoyed in arguments, and it can just be ignored as oh, they're just emotional, their couple's just going through a tough time or something along those lines. And I think society often overlooks them. As I said, I think a lot of the people go through these similar, quite universal issues when they're in relationships, and so people deem it as something just natural and normal. And to a certain extent it is, to have arguments with your partner or to have arguments with people, to get frustrated. But obviously the context needs to come into play, and people need to look into the situation a bit more and pay a bit more careful attention. Instead of just passing it off being oh, they're shouting at each other, they're saying all this nonsense, oh, they're just having couple issues. Maybe they could I don't know, look into that a bit more. But I think I'm going into another question. But yeah, I think that's mainly the reason that society overlooks them. And also I think it's quite hard to judge when you should step in and when you should sort of say, okay, this isn't something that shouldn't happen. It feels oh, you should leave the business up to them. It should just be left to the couple or the 2 people involved to deal with it, and people just don't want to know a lot of the times. Okay, on to the second question. How does the book challenge the idea that violence only begins when there is physical aggression? What other forms of violence became visible to you through Liliana's story? Well, it challenges the idea that violence only begins with physical aggression because, well, from the moment they met, I remember reading that Liliana, through Liliana's obviously diary entries and what she wrote, that they met at a gym and he was very pushy. It wasn't physical, it wasn't anything abusive, outright violence, but he was very pushy and just kept on sort of pursuing her. And yeah, so it doesn't just begin with physical violence or physical aggression. Pardon me. It begins in often, I think, quite like subtle ways. Just being like, oh, I'm interested in you, but maybe not getting the picture and being a bit too pushy, or getting the idea. Sorry, I'm being a bit too pushy, and then that like turning into more like the physical aggression. Yeah. Right, on to the next question. In what way do silence, indifference, or victim blaming allow violence against women to continue in society? Well, I remember reading quite a powerful, oh, there's a car coming past, sorry. But I remember reading quite a powerful section in the book where the author is talking about the Mexican judicial system, and she's kind of describing it as like a machine, like a well-oiled machine, which like cuts up and just does not do justice. I think it was a bit of time that I read it ago actually, but she described it as a machine, and I think it was quite powerful because it highlighted how it's a systemic issue where victim blaming allows the system of victim blaming, sorry, allows the system to continue churning out the violence against women. For example, I think in the book it mentioned how often women, people trying to blame women, they say, oh, like, why didn't she wait till marriage to have sex? Why didn't she wait a bit of time to get a boyfriend? Why weren't the parents, why did they send her from Toluca to Mexico City? Like, there's all these different factors they're bringing up apart from the actual root cause, which is the man was just like, the society is sort of pushes, I think, a lot of the times men into systems where the society sort of like creates this violence towards women, essentially. I'm not sure if I put it too correctly or too like it's quite hard without a script, I can't lie. But yeah, I think, and then also like the silence aspect and indifference, people don't want to address it. I think there's also there was a specific section in the book which talked about her parents keeping her room the exact same. I think the silence of that and not like creating a fuss, and obviously the investigation got dropped and the family didn't have enough money to sort of bribe the officials. So again, I think all of these factors sort of culminate to allow for a system which continues to push violence towards women. Okay, next question. How are power, control, and certain expectations about masculinity connected to the violence portrayed in the book? So I kind of touched on this already, but I think that society nowadays, it kind of pushes men. It's a system which creates, I think, the oppressors. Like, I don't think you can necessarily, obviously you can't take the blame away from men that like are violent towards women, right? But I think there has to, you can't just look at it in a vacuum. Like, these men weren't just randomly aggressive. They weren't just randomly sort of violent. There was a system which created the violence and sort of created the men wanting to be violent towards the women. And I think that like especially certain expectations, relating it back to the question, I think certain expectations about masculinity and definitely the control, they create the violence a lot of the times, and they allow for the violence to happen. Like, for example, the boyfriend in the book of Liliana, he wanted to control her. Like, I think there was one section where I can't remember his name, but I think it's the friend of Liliana, the one who finds the body that is an architecture student that goes to the house, and he's like, oh, like he's how wait, well, I've just lost my train of thought. I'm completely but yeah, okay. So he kind of wants to blame himself for like the murder, because maybe the boyfriend seeing Liliana and him together would make him jealous. Obviously, because the boyfriend wanted complete control of Liliana, and I think those expectations about how a man is meant to act in a relationship are very damaging and create the environment for violence towards women. Yeah. Okay, on to the last question. After reading the book, what do you think individuals and communities can do to prevent violence while protecting the dignity and promoting social justice? I think definitely a lot of it comes with communication, like on the male behalf, because there's two spectrums to it, like the women and the men, in my opinion. I mean, it doesn't have to, it's not necessarily always just, men creating violence towards women, actually. I think, yeah, maybe victim and perpetrator is a better like angle to look at it from. But I think definitely the communication from the people around the perpetrator needs to be, like, the volume needs to be increased, right? So I think if a lot of the times I've had, even in my experience, I've had people that I was friends with that have acted like really out of order towards women. And I think maybe when I was a bit younger, I usually just was like, oh, okay, it's fine, like, it's none of my business. They're acting a bit weird, but they're a bit young maybe. It's one of their first relationships. But I think calling them out is definitely a step in the right direction. Obviously, it might not, solve all of the issues. I think the issues which create like men to be violent towards women in society, I think it's a lot more systemic and deep than that, and it can't just be solved with calling your friend out. But I think it's a step in the right direction. I think just stepping back and think, and like if you say to your friend like, look, what the fuck are you doing? I'm not sure if you're allowed to swear, you're probably not, but sorry. But just stepping back and saying, oh, like, what's going on? What are you doing? You shouldn't be acting like that. It's a step in the right direction, and it makes them sort of take a step back and think, like, maybe evaluate their actions a bit more. And on the other side, for the victim, I think, like, definitely not just sweeping it under the rug, right? I think especially there should be justice, like in the, to promote social justice. It shouldn't be dropped, for example, just like in the book. And what was most like crazy to me is how he fled to the US, like the boyfriend fled to the US, and he only died in 2020. He died of drowning. So like there was never actual justice done, in my opinion. Maybe karmic justice by him drowning, but I haven't looked too much into like how he died and whatnot. But yeah, there was no like proper justice for the family, and he was allowed, through the gross negligence of the like bureaucratic system and the justice system, he was allowed to go free after it, just to flee to the US and then live his life up until, I think, 2020 he died, something like that. But yeah, that is definitely something which needs to be changed. The justice system, when dealing with these cases, needs to be like astute and like aware of everything and really on the ball, I think. But as a wider issue, I think it's a lot in media as well. Like men are pushed to be like dominant, controlling, like not really care about how the woman feels maybe. I think a lot of our media that we consume creates sort of the subconscious thoughts in your mind to be violent towards women, and I think re-education of that is a step in the right direction. But yeah, that was my that was the those that's the end of the questions. I hope that's good. I've been talking for a bit of time now, so yeah, perfect.